The fluorescent lights above the conference table buzzed with a sound like trapped insects. I remember noticing that detail, the way the sound seemed too loud in the silence, the way my attorney kept clicking her pen against her notepad in a rhythm that I found oddly comforting. Across the table, my husband of 31 years sat with his attorney, a man in a gray suit who had already set a thick stack of financial documents in front of him like he was preparing to build a fortress. I folded my hands in my lap and told myself to breathe. My daughter, seated just behind me in the gallery, leaned forward and briefly touched my shoulder. I didn't turn around. I was afraid that if I looked at her face, I would start crying, and I had promised myself I would not cry in front of my husband again. Not ever again. The mediator cleared her throat and began going through the asset list. My husband, who I will call by the name I have called him for 3 decades, my husband did not look at me once. Not once. He sat with his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him, occasionally murmuring something to his attorney, occasionally allowing himself a small, tight smile when a number on the page seemed to please him. I had been erased so completely from this marriage, I thought, that even in its official dissolution, I was little more than a category on a spreadsheet. I want to tell you who I was before I became invisible. I was Dorothy Callahan. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. I was the first person in my family to attend college, studying education at Ohio State, and I spent 11 years teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary. I loved it. I loved the specific joy of watching a child suddenly understand something, the way their face would change, like a light coming on in a window. I was good at my job. My principal told me once that I had a gift for reaching children who had stopped believing they could learn. I kept that in a corner of my heart for a long time. I met my husband at a dinner party when I was 32. He was handsome, in a very specific way, confident, composed, the kind of man who stood at the center of every room and made other people orbit around him without seeming to try. He was an engineer, successful, 10 years older than me. He had strong opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them persuasively. On our 3rd date, he told me he thought women who worked once they had children were making a mistake. He said it so reasonably, so warmly, the way a person states something that is simply obvious and good, that I didn't register it as a warning. We married. We had 2 children. When our first was born, my husband suggested gently, the way he always suggested things that were not actually suggestions, that I take a leave of absence. Just a year, he said, just until the baby was settled. The year became 2 years. The 2 years became 5. When our second child started school, I told my husband I wanted to go back to teaching. He had a list of reasons why that was impractical. He always had a list. The hours, the schedule conflicts. What would happen in summer? What if one of the children got sick? Who would handle everything while I was in a classroom all day? He laid these reasons out the way he laid everything out, methodically, patiently, as if he was doing me a favor by thinking of things I had failed to think of myself. I did not go back to teaching. Instead, I ran the household. I raised the children. I attended every function, managed every calendar, organized every holiday. I drove my daughter to her dance classes and my son to his baseball practices and later to his college visits. I made dinners that my husband mostly ate without comment. I learned that the fastest way to avoid a difficult conversation was to anticipate what might cause one and preemptively remove it, and I got very good at that particular skill, which is not really a skill at all. It is more like the habit of making yourself smaller so that someone else can have more room. My son grew up and moved to Denver. My daughter settled nearby, married a man who actually looked at her when she spoke to him, and gave me the only grandchild I have ever needed, a boy named Eli. Eli was 13 years old at the time this story takes place. He was quiet in the way that observant people are quiet, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was always watching, always collecting, always filing things away in that careful mind of his. He did well in school without seeming to try. He had my daughter's dark eyes and my husband's jaw, and some quality entirely his own that I could never quite name, something that made him seem older and younger than he was at the same time. My husband was never particularly warm toward Eli. He had never been particularly warm toward any child who didn't serve some immediate purpose in his narrative of the family. Eli was sensitive to this in the way children are. He felt the coolness and responded by giving my husband a wide, polite birth at family gatherings. My husband interpreted this as the boy being withdrawn. It was not withdrawal. It was self-protection, and I recognized it because I had been practicing my own version of it for 30 years. The marriage had been eroding for longer than I could name a specific starting point. There was no single catastrophic event. There was no dramatic betrayal, no screaming fight that ended with suitcases being packed. It was quieter and slower and in some ways more damaging than that the accumulated weight of 3 decades of being managed, being minimized, being explained to, being told what I actually meant when I said something. My husband was not a man who shouted. He never needed to. He had other methods, more refined and more effective. A certain tone of patient exasperation that he used when I expressed an opinion he found incorrect. A silence that he could extend for days without acknowledgement, while I moved around the house trying to diagnose what I had done, trying to fix it, trying to make the temperature return to normal. The way he spoke about me to other people, a slight emphasis here, a careful word choice there that communicated to anyone paying attention that I was sweet but not entirely reliable, that my instincts were good but my judgment was soft. I was 63 years old when I finally understood that what I had been living in was not a difficult marriage but a controlled one. That understanding came from an unlikely source, a therapist my daughter had been gently suggesting for 2 years and that I had finally agreed to see. I will not claim the therapy was immediately transformative. In the beginning, I spent most of the sessions defending my husband. I explained his behavior in the generous terms I had been using for 30 years. He was under pressure, he had a difficult upbringing, he showed love in ways that were hard to read, he didn't mean things the way they sounded. My therapist listened to all of this with a patience that I eventually understood was not agreement. It took 5 months for me to stop defending him. It took another 3 months to say out loud, to another human being, that I was frightened of the way my husband's moods governed my life, that I had not made a single significant decision in 30 years without calculating how he would respond to it. That I did not know what I enjoyed anymore because I had not allowed myself to prefer anything that he preferred differently. The night I said that out loud, I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes. The house lights were on. I could see my husband moving past the kitchen window. I filed for divorce 8 months later. My husband did not take it the way I had spent 30 years fearing he would take it. He was calm. He was organized. He retained an attorney within the week, who was known as my own attorney, quietly informed me for aggressive asset protection strategies. He moved into the guest room without drama. He continued to eat dinner at the table as though nothing had changed, except that he began addressing me with a careful, formal courtesy that was somehow more devastating than any anger would have been. It communicated efficiently and without words that he had already reclassified me. The financial picture became complicated quickly. My husband was an engineer who had spent 31 years managing our money with the same methodical competence he applied to everything else. He had accounts I had not known existed, transfers that his attorney described as entirely routine, entirely legal, entirely ordinary. Our marital home had appreciated significantly, and he had structured the title in ways that my attorney explained to me in terms I struggled to follow, but the essential meaning of which was, "This is going to be harder than you expected." I had no income of my own. I had no pension. I had no retirement account in my name that was substantial. I had been out of the workforce for 30 years. I was 63 years old. My husband's attorney, at one of the early financial disclosure meetings, said in that pleasant, matter-of-fact tone that people use when they want to say something cruel while maintaining plausible deniability, that Dorothy had certainly benefited from 30 years of financial security and that the court would surely take into account the considerable lifestyle she had enjoyed. My attorney started to respond. I put my hand on her arm. I said, "I'd like to continue, please." But I knew, sitting there in that conference room, that what I was facing was not just the end of a marriage. It was the quiet, systematic conclusion of a long project my husband had been running without my awareness, the project of making sure that if this day ever came, he would be holding almost everything, and I would be holding almost nothing. My daughter and Eli came for dinner one Thursday evening, about 3 weeks before the scheduled mediation hearing. My daughter was worried. She had been trying to hide it from me since the divorce proceedings began, performing a careful optimism that I recognized as protective and that I loved her for. But that evening, after dinner, when Eli had gone to set up his things in the guest room where he'd be staying the night, she sat across from me at the kitchen table and let the performance drop. She said she was scared about the financial settlement. She had talked to my attorney. She understood the structural problem. She said, gently, that she and her husband could help if things got difficult, that I would not be alone. I told her I knew that. I told her I was grateful. I told her I was going to be fine. I almost believed it. What I did not know, at that particular moment, was that my grandson was in the guest room with his phone, listening through the wall. Later, Eli told me everything in the kind of careful, sequential order that I recognized as characteristic of him, not leaving things out, not dramatizing, just presenting the facts in the sequence in which they had occurred, as though he were giving a witness statement, which in some sense he was. He told me that he had overheard my husband on the phone the previous weekend, while visiting with his mother to pick up some of my things that my husband had boxed up. He had been in the hallway outside my husband's study. The door had been slightly open. He had not meant to listen, but the conversation had been loud enough to hear clearly, and what he heard had made him stop walking. My husband was speaking to someone Eli did not know who about a specific account. He was talking about the timing of a transfer. He used a phrase that Eli, 13 years old, did not entirely understand but wrote down carefully in the Notes app on his phone the moment he was back in the car. Eli had then done something that I found both alarming and deeply characteristic of him. He had gone back. Not that day. The following Saturday, when my daughter had dropped him at the house to retrieve his basketball from the garage, he had taken his phone into the hallway outside the study and recorded 9 minutes of my husband on a phone call. He had not told me. He had not told his mother. He had sat on this for 2 weeks, in a kind of careful 13-year-old deliberation, until the evening at my kitchen table when he had heard his mother and me talking about how scared we were. He knocked on the kitchen door after his mother had gone to the bathroom. He came in quietly. He set his phone on the table in front of me. He said, "Grandma, I think you should hear this." I listened to the recording twice. Then I called my attorney. She was quiet for a long time after I described what was on it. Then she said, "Send it to me tonight." I sent it to her that night. She called me the next morning. Her voice was different, not excited exactly, but with a particular focused quality that I had not heard from her before. She said she needed to have it evaluated. She said I should not discuss it with anyone except her. She said we needed to talk about how it could be introduced. I said, "My grandson recorded it." She said she knew that. She said she was working on it. What followed were 10 days of the strangest quality I can remember, going through the ordinary motions of my ordinary life while knowing that something significant was in motion, something that I had not engineered and could not fully control. Something that had come from the most unexpected direction imaginable. My grandson had done this for me. A 13-year-old boy who was not supposed to understand what was happening, who was supposed to be kept outside of it, who I had been careful not to burden. He had seen more clearly than any adult in the situation what was necessary and had acted on it in the quiet, methodical way that was entirely his own. I thought about that for a long time in the days before the hearing. The mediation center was in a glass office building downtown. The elevator opened onto a reception area with gray carpet and a watercolor painting of a lake that I spent more time looking at than it deserved, because looking at it gave me something to do with my eyes other than look at my husband. He arrived with his attorney 3 minutes after I arrived with mine. He nodded at me in that new formal way. His attorney set down the same fortress of documents. My attorney set down a tablet. My husband's attorney opened the session in the established way, going through the framework of the proposed settlement, the asset classifications, the valuation methodology. My husband sat with his arms crossed lightly, with the posture of a man who had already calculated the outcome and found it satisfactory. My attorney waited. She let them go through the full presentation. She took notes. She asked 2 clarifying questions that seemed routine. My husband's attorney answered them with the patient ease of a man who expected the morning to be uncomplicated. Then my attorney said, "Before we address the proposed settlement figures, there's a matter I'd like to raise. It relates to the characterization of the Pacific Trust account and the timeline of the transfer made in March." My husband's attorney said, That transfer has been fully disclosed and categorized. My attorney said, "Yes. I'd like to discuss the characterization of that categorization." She paused, "And some information that has recently come to our attention regarding the communications that preceded that transfer." There was a brief silence. My attorney looked at the mediator. She said, "I'd like to play an audio recording. It was captured on a private residential property, and our position, which we're prepared to support with relevant case documentation, is that it falls within the scope of admissible evidence in this proceeding." My husband's attorney said immediately, "We'd object to the introduction of any." The mediator raised her hand slightly and said she would hear the recording before ruling on its admissibility. She asked my attorney to proceed. My attorney pressed play. My husband's voice filled the room. It was unmistakably his voice, that particular cadence, that particular measured confidence. He was talking about the Pacific Trust account. He was talking about the timing of the reclassification. He was saying, with the comfortable specificity of a man who believed he was in a private conversation, exactly what the purpose of the transfer had been. I looked at my husband for the first time that morning. His face had changed. It was a very specific kind of change, not the collapse of a guilty man, but the recalculation of a man who had been operating on a set of assumptions and had just discovered one of those assumptions was wrong. He was not panicking. He was too controlled for panic. But his jaw had tightened in a way I had seen very rarely in 31 years, only in moments when something had not gone according to plan. And I knew that expression, the way you know the expressions of anyone you have lived beside for 3 decades. His attorney put his hand on my husband's arm and leaned over to say something quietly. The mediator stopped the recording about 4 minutes in and said she had heard enough for the purpose of determining admissibility. She asked some procedural questions. My attorney answered them methodically. My husband's attorney made 2 objections, both of which the mediator took under consideration with a careful neutrality that told me nothing about what she was thinking. Then the mediator said she would take a brief recess. In the corridor, my attorney stood very close to me and spoke quietly. She said the recording, combined with the documentation she had assembled around the timeline, was significant. She said she was not going to make promises because this was a mediation proceeding and not a court of law, and the other side still had room to maneuver, but she said the landscape had shifted. I asked her about Eli. She said that the question of who had captured the recording and under what circumstances was a matter she had spent the last 10 days researching carefully. She said the legal landscape on this was not perfectly uniform, but that she was comfortable with our position. She said the most important thing was that the recording existed and that it was authentic and that its content was what it was. She said, "The other side knows what's on it. They know we have it. That changes what they're willing to agree to." I stood in that corridor with its gray carpet and its recycled air and thought about my grandson sitting in a hallway with his phone, writing notes on the screen, making a decision that no adult in his life had asked him to make. I thought about what it means to be seen by someone who is not supposed to be old enough to see you. We reconvened after 40 minutes. My husband's attorney said that his client was prepared to consider a revised framework for the settlement discussion. The way he said it with the particular careful grammar of a man retreating in good order told me everything I needed to know about what had happened in that 40 minutes. What followed was 4 more hours of negotiation that I will not walk through in detail, because the details belong to legal documents and not to this story. What I will tell you is that the number that emerged from those 4 hours was not the number that had been on the table that morning. It was a different number. A number that my attorney, on the elevator down, allowed herself to describe as fair. She said it in a tone that communicated she had not been certain, at the start of that day, that fair was what we were going to get. I said, "Tell me what to do next," she told me. I listened. I took notes on my phone, the way I had been taking notes on everything since this began, not because I didn't trust my memory, but because I had learned, over the course of this process, that documenting things was a form of protection, and that protection was something I now understood I was allowed to want. My daughter was waiting in the parking structure. She had come downtown during her lunch break and parked 2 levels below the mediation center and sat in her car for the last 2 hours because she had not been able to make herself drive away. When she saw my face, she got out of the car. I told her what had happened. Not all of it. Not the procedural details, but the shape of it. What had been offered. what had been agreed to, what the recording had done to the morning. She started crying. She covered her mouth with her hand the way she has covered her mouth since she was a small girl, a habit that has never changed, and I thought for a moment about all the years I had spent watching her grow up, all the things I had wanted to give her that I had not been able to give her, and all the things she had somehow become anyway. I told her that when she talked to Eli, she should tell him that I wanted to speak to him myself. She asked if everything was okay. I said, "Everything is fine, I just want to tell him something." Eli came over that Sunday with his mother. He sat across from me at the kitchen table in the afternoon light, this tall, careful, quiet boy with his dark eyes and his specific kind of stillness, and I looked at him for a moment before I said anything. I said, "I know what you did." He looked at me steadily. He didn't pretend not to understand. I said, "I want to know why you didn't tell me." Before the hearing, when you first heard him, he thought about this. He said, "I wasn't sure it was enough. I wanted to get more. The first time I heard him, it was just pieces. I needed the whole thing. I knew if I told you too early, you'd worry about it, and you were already worried about too many things." I looked at this boy for a long moment. I said, "You were protecting me." He lifted one shoulder. He said, "You protect people. That's what you do." I didn't say anything for a few seconds. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table between us. I said, "Eli, when you grow up and the world is very unfair to you, and it will be, at least sometimes, I want you to remember that you did this, that you were 13 years old and you saw something clearly and you did something about it, quietly, on your own, without being asked. Not a lot of people can do that at any age." He looked slightly embarrassed, the way 13-year-olds look when they receive a serious compliment and don't know the correct response to it. I said, "You are going to be a remarkable person." He said, quietly, "I just didn't want him to win." The final paperwork was signed 6 weeks later. I stood outside the attorney's office on a Tuesday afternoon in November, in the cold air, and I thought about the fact that I was 63 years old and free, which was not a combination of things I had expected to be true simultaneously. My daughter called to ask how I was. I said I was standing on the sidewalk thinking about what I wanted to do. She asked what I was thinking about specifically. I told her that I had been reading, in the evenings since the proceedings began, about literacy programs for adults, programs that used volunteer teachers. I told her I had been thinking about the 11 years I spent in a third-grade classroom, about the principal who said I had a gift for reaching children who had stopped believing they could learn, about how long I had been carrying that particular memory in my chest without doing anything with it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, do it." I said I wasn't sure the skills were still there. She said, "They're still there." I thought about Eli in that hallway, writing careful notes on his phone screen. I thought about what it looks like when someone sees something clearly and decides to act on it without waiting to be told. I said, "Okay." I found the name of the program that Thursday. I sent the inquiry email that same evening. I was not 32 years old anymore. I was not who I had been before the marriage, and I was not who I had been inside it. I was someone else, someone being assembled from parts I had been carrying for a long time without knowing what they were for. The response came back the following Monday morning. They would love to have me. Could I come in for a brief orientation the following week? I wrote back, "Yes, I'll be there." I closed my laptop and looked out the kitchen window at the yard, which was mine now, at the bare November trees and the gray sky and the particular quality of light that comes in late autumn when everything has been stripped down to its essential structure. I had been invisible for a very long time. I was done with that.